Is there something in your life you love way too much? Is there something you love doing? Maybe it's even a food or a habit or a hobby that you have that if God asked you to give up, you'd be like, that's too much, God. That's too crazy or too out there. I want you to think about, is there something in your life that would be too much to give up to God? Hey everyone, welcome to the Healthy Christian Podcast. This is season 4, episode 3. And in this season, we've been talking about how to be healthy spiritually. And we're diving into parables. Really excited to jump into today's parable about temptation and how sin tends to try to rule our life and get us focused on the wrong things. So if you're just joining in this podcast, we're kind of going through some parables in Matthew chapter 18. And in the book of Matthew, one key thing that Matthew is trying to do is connect all of these things to Jesus. Old Testament prophecies and actions and how Jesus is fulfilling them, and also how Jesus right now during his time was bringing God's kingdom to earth. It wasn't as much about trying to get to heaven as bringing heaven to earth. So here we are in these parables by Jesus. And if you're just diving in and you don't know what parables are, go back and listen to the introduction about parables on episode 1. So here we go. Matthew 18, verse 7 says this: "Woe to the world for temptations to sin. For it is necessary that temptations come. But woe to the one who is tempted when it comes. And if your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life crippled or lame than with 2 hands and 2 feet and be thrown into eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out, throw it away. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than with 2 eyes to be thrown into the hell of fire." Wow. Really important, powerful parable that Jesus is bringing up. You can see clearly Jesus does not like sin. And even this word temptations, the temptation to sin. So there's an option there not to sin and not to go down that path. But what is sin? I think it's really important for us to define sin and understand how God and the Bible is trying to define sin for us, because Jesus looks at sin in this passage as a really big deal and something that's going to cause problems in our life to the point where he's saying you should avoid this at all costs. So think about for a moment, how do you define sin? Just pause before we dive into this. Think, reflect. What is sin to you? Maybe you were raised in church, or you've got some Bible knowledge and you've kind of been taught what certain sins are and not, or maybe you have no context of sin. Maybe you view sin as right and wrong. There's some moral ideas that you have, but just kind of put that on your mind right now. What do you think sin is? And so let's kind of let the Bible define what sin is and some examples that Jesus has given. We see the word sin used in a way to miss the mark. Okay, so God has an ideal for our life. He designed Eden in Genesis chapter 1, and God set in order things that were good. Well, sin enters the equation when human beings begin to decide what is good and what is evil, what is right, what is wrong, what we should do and what we shouldn't do. And so instead of doing God's ideal of good, we define it, and therefore we actually miss the mark. We miss God's best for our life in the way that God has created it. And what happened in the garden in Adam and Eve is the temptation to define things on our own terms causes us to be separated from God. So in the beginning, God created all these things, and Adam and Eve fell to the temptation, the desire to want to define this. Therefore, they're kicked out of the garden, which from eternity, from a life with closeness with God, and they're now separated. So sin kind of does 2 things. It is separating us from God because we have missed the mark. and we haven't achieved God's ideal for our life. And really, what sin is doing is it is making us focus on the flesh. It's making us focus on our natural desires or fleshly desires or the world around us, and it's making us put that first instead of the things of the Spirit. Instead of things of God, we are putting what we see, what we feel, what we understand before God's ways, which are spiritual ways. And so God's ways is always going to drive us to love Him and to love others. So sin draws us away from God, separates us from God, and separates us from others. And we don't love others the way we should. And so sin, you can, and this is a very simple definition here, but it's getting your mind thinking around it from a different framework. Is sin is going to separate, and sin is missing the mark. So when we begin to look at Jesus's parable and his teachings here, and he's like, woe to the world for the temptation to sin. There is a desire in all of us to define good on our own terms. And it is necessary that these temptations come because we have to remind ourselves we're not in control. We didn't create this world. We don't know what is very best. But these temptations are going to come to us, and what we do with these temptations is so important. So when you are tempted to do something, guess what this temptation does? It actually identifies what you're loyal to. So when a temptation comes up, something that you want to do, you are going to do and fall to that temptation if that desire is inside your heart. Let me give you an example. If someone put a plate of mushrooms in front of me to eat, I'm not going to have any temptation to eat that whatsoever. But if you put a plate of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies in front of me, I'm going to be tempted, very much so, to eat those cookies because I like them. I enjoy eating them, but I'm not tempted at all by mushrooms whatsoever. So we have to realize this in our own life is that temptation is going to become stronger and stronger the more we actually desire it. So if there's things in your life that are not good for you, that don't draw you closer to God and others and harms and creates separation, then the temptation is in because you desire it. So these are flags or things that God reveals to us in our life when we are tempted. It shows an area of our life that needs to be healed, that we need to give to God and say, you know what, God, I give you this. I need your strength, grace, wisdom in my life to overcome this. So it exposes our heart and what's inside of us when we are tempted. Another key thing when it comes to sin is you can love sin so much that it becomes really hard to give up. And what Jesus is doing in this parable is he's comparing sin to body parts. He's saying that it would be better for you to be crippled or lame than to go into eternal fire, than to let sin cause this eternal separation from you and God. So he's comparing this sin and this tension that we would be having with our own body. I mean, we all love our hands and our feet and our limbs, and we want a complete and whole and healthy body. So to think about me actually sacrificing a hand on purpose seems so foreign. It seems like a crazy idea that I would separate myself from something that I love and that is a part of me. And I think this is a good example and a great example because Jesus gave it. And we have to understand that sin can be really hard to let go. There could be habits and things that we've done in our life for so long that they are actually part of us. I know many people that have done certain drugs or had certain habits their entire life, and to give that up feels like it's giving up a piece of them. They feel like when they try to give up consuming these drugs that they literally feel like that they have given up something inside of them. They've given up almost like an organ or maybe a limb, something that they have depended on for so long. And sin can be so ingrained in us in our life that it feels this way. that it feels like we are giving up something that we desire so much. I mean, you love your body. You take care of it. Most of us, it's really hard not to please the flesh, to please what our body desires to do. So we love ourselves. So how do we fall out of love with sin? How do we let go of something that we may actually love that is not good for us? And this parable is challenging that thinking, is that you may have something in your life that you think is good, that you love, but yet it's causing you eternal problems to please the flesh and your desires right now. Another thing that we can really take out of this parable is God's ways are to love him and others. When we remove sin from our life, when we remove pleasing the flesh, that it allows us to love God and love others better. And this is important for us to understand, that sin is separating us from God and separating us from our best. And there is going to be temptations out there that are really hard. But scripture also says that God is not giving us any temptation that he has not given us the strength to overcome. So some practical next steps that I want you to take away from this parable is, what is something too big that you feel like it is to give up? Is there something in your life you love way too much? Is there something you love doing? Maybe it's even a food or a habit or a hobby that you have, that if God asked you to give up, you'd be like, that's too much, God. That's too crazy or too out there. I want you to think about, is there something in your life that would be too much to give up to God? And if not, I want you to ask God, say, hey, God, why don't you open up my eyes to anything in my life that maybe I'm missing the mark, where I have kind of gone separated from you, and I've separated, God, your desire from in my life. Just ask God, let God speak into your life and reveal if there's any, what many of us would just call sin. I've heard a pastor one time call sin a pet sin, that sometimes there's things in our life that we allow, that we put up with because we like it. So to say, God, is there anything in my life, Lord, that I am allowing into my life? Maybe I don't even realize it. Maybe it's something subconsciously that I've been doing my entire life and I don't even know. But our desire should be to be closer to God, to love him more, and to love others, because this is what brings God's kingdom to earth, is when we remove the barriers from our own life. We look at the plank in our own eye. We look at the problems in our life instead of projecting and looking at the problems in others. So believe it or not, temptations can draw us closer to God if we allow them and they don't lead to sin. If we take these temptations and desires that we have and we give them to God. So a really good resource on this and this word sin, and unpacking this word sin even more than what we kind of discussed here today, is there's a Bible Project video on sin. It dives into the different depths and levels of sin. Really great video. I want to encourage you to go out and watch that few-minute video that the Bible Project has out on sin. So I really want to encourage you, as we wrap this episode up, is press in, read this parable over this week, allow God to speak to you through his word, and reveal to you anything that's going on in your life that is preventing you from experiencing the best life that God has for you. Hope you find this encouraging, and I look forward to talking with you really soon. Thank you for tuning in to the Healthy Christian Podcast. Now it's your turn to put these principles we've discussed into action. We'd love to hear how they've impacted you. Please rate, review, and share the podcast with others. Join us on social media to continue the conversation and share your insights. Until next time, stay healthy.